If you clicked on this video, that means you are new to Dungeons and Dragons and you either just played your first campaign or you're about to play your first campaign. And I've got some tips that every beginner needs to know to get started. So now that you've fallen down the D&D rabbit hole, let's dig ourselves even deeper.
Welcome to the 20 Sides podcast channel. Today we have Kate, who played Mira in our Patreon campaign. And Kate is a first-time D&D player. She's been around it and heard about it, but the Patreon campaign, the other side, was actually her first experience playing D&D. So we definitely wanted to get her on here to say, Kate, if you had tips for someone who is new to D&D or wants to play D&D or doesn't have any idea where to start, or they're about to start and they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed because D&D can be a lot sometimes, what would be your tips for someone who is on the cusp of about to play Dungeons & Dragons? Let's say they have a character.
Okay.
Their gracious and grateful DM helped them put everything together. What are your tips?
So tip number one, at 20 Sides, we always say hashtag know your character. So what I mean by that is to know your character sheet. So the night before you're getting ready to play, take your character sheet out and look at some of the important pieces of that. What traits do they have? What features? What can they do in battle? And just the basics so that when you get to the table, you have a pretty deep knowledge of your character, which will just make it easier when you're role playing, when you're trying to play off of what someone else is doing, because you know what your character is all about.
Yeah. And knowing what your character can and can't do makes it so much easier to role play because you're not worried about well, what do I do next? Or what can I do here or can't I do here? There's going to be some of that just because you're getting started.
Right.
But yes, if you can deep dive into your character sheet and see oh, okay, my stealth is a lot higher of a plus than anything else is. So if something happens and somebody needs to sneak, that's me because I have that character trait. My character can do that. So I completely agree. That's why we always say hashtag know your character. Even when we get into higher levels and somebody pulls something out, we will always laugh and go hashtag know your character. That's a know your character moment.
Yep.
So absolutely, that's a great tip for tip number one.
So tip number two, I would say know your dice and know the different sides. Your main character dice, for example, is going to be your D20, and that's the one that you're going to use the most. So for example, typically anytime you are doing something in the game, you're going to roll your D20, and whether it's high or low is going to tell you whether you're successful or not at that action.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other dice are really going to be dependent on your character. So if you're a rogue and you're very stabby, that's going to be more like a D6.
Right.
If you are a barbarian and you're smashy, it might be a D10 that you're rolling or something like that. And so knowing what all dice that you're going to use, we kind of revert back to tip number one with hashtag know your character. So that when you get into combat, you know that you're rolling your D20 first. If your D20 is successful and you hit, you'll know what dice you're going to grab from there to roll, because there are several dice to pick from. So that's a really good tip.
Well, and I will say that D&D and Beyond makes it really easy to roll the dice. So when we first started, I wasn't using D&D and Beyond, but something that was really helpful that you did was you wrote out on a sheet of paper the different sides, so D7, D10, D20, and then put the dice that were that many sides in the quadrant so that I could easily pick up because I was not familiar with what a 10-sided dice looked like.
And for all those at home, yes, there is no D7 dice, but that's okay. But again, as a new player, that's why you do those things, is because there are so many different dice. A lot of them you haven't seen before.
Right.
And
you learn the shapes eventually.
As you go, you pick it up.
But at first, if you don't have them laid out like that, then you're trying to count quadrants to roll it.
And as a new player, a lot of times it can be an intense like situation.
Right.
And this is kind of intense, or this combat is happening, or we're trying to persuade this guard to whatever. And then when you have to stop and figure out, wait, what dice do I roll? What's that for? What's this one? It just kind of takes you out of kind of the feel and what's happening. So I think that's a great tip.
So tip number 1 and 2 are pretty general, but tip number 3 is a little bit more based on my experience and probably what I would do had I known and was starting over. And it was like my first time again. I probably would have picked a simpler character. And so Mira's a sorcerer. And so she's pretty simple probably to start with, but there's spell slots. And I feel like there's different traits and characteristics that you have to know, like what's going on with a sorcerer versus maybe some of the other characters are a lot simpler. So to start, when you're also learning the game and trying to role play and doing all of those things, like knowing what I know now, I may have picked a simpler character so that it was easier for me to learn it and be able to be in character without feeling like I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing.
Any spellcaster, like a wizard, a warlock, a sorcerer, any of those are going to have extra things to keep up with. Different spell slots for different spell levels, and then what spells are at which spell level, what's a cantrip so that I can cast that as many times as I want versus I only have this many slots left, which is another way that D&D Beyond kind of helps with that, being able to just mark off there. Some people will use their character sheet, so the hashtag know your character part, where they will just mark off on the paper. Either way, that helps, but it is another level of things to keep up with.
Yeah.
Again, your rogues who are stabby, like that's just what they do. Right. They're stabby. Barbarians the same way. They're gonna run in and smashy. Like that's what they're gonna do. So It is, again, be what you want to be the character, create the character that you want to.
Because that's a part of it too, like having fun with it. And if you want to be a certain character, like you were just obsessed with Harry Potter, so you want to be a wizard, like go with it.
Go for it. But go into it knowing that hashtag know your character part is going to be a lot deeper than if you were a fighter and all you're going to do is swing your great sword. Like that's a big difference for sure. So those are 3 great tips, by the way. So if you're getting started, definitely get out a notepad or put it in your phone, because those are great tips to start with. I want to ask about, as a new player, we played 2 different ways. And this is because of the true big bad evil guy that's in Dungeons and Dragons, and that is scheduling. So because of scheduling, we played at the table a few times, but then we played remotely online more. Which did you prefer?
I mean, I think I definitely preferred at the table.
Why do you think
Just because you're able to be more in the experience of it.
Yeah, in the moment.
Yeah.
Things seem to be funnier.
Yeah, they're funnier and you catch things and, I mean, it's the internet. Like stuff lags, people freeze, just things like that happen and it takes you out of it. And so, I would say in person for sure.
So for somebody who's going to be playing at the table, off the top of your head, because I know this is I didn't ask this question before. If you had one thing that you were going to tell a new player who is coming to the table, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say I'd probably go back to know your character. And because it's really fast paced when you're in person and, all the different role play that's going on and you want to be able to participate and be involved. And so knowing your character makes it easier for when things are really fast paced, like you can jump in easier because you have a little bit more of an understanding and you're not having to look up everything.
For sure. And I would say even seasoned players will tell you that at the table, there's other distractions and things that are happening. And then it'll be all of a sudden, hey, it's your go. And you're like, oh yeah. And so now as a seasoned player, because we know our characters, it's easier to just jump in and go. But as a new player, I think that's also, great tip. For someone playing online, first experience, new, playing online, what would be a tip for you?
Well, I think playing online with anything, right? Like even when you're taking an online class or you're working from home online, like you're in a webinar, you have to make sure you don't have a ton of distractions because playing online, it's a lot easier for your phone to light up and or something to ping on your computer. And when you're in person, I don't know, it just seems harder for those things to pull you out as it does when you're playing online. But I also think playing online makes it a little, or at least for me, made it easier to focus and to keep up with what was going on in the game because playing online really makes it where people can only go one at a time or really only one person can talk at a time, where when you're playing in person at the table there's a lot of different things that can be happening that it's easier to miss. So I would say that was my experience with it online.
I think that's a good point, because at the table it does tend to be so many things kind of pinging back and forth, that having that kind of like one-to-one. And I will say that online combat seemed to go faster, because like you're saying, it wasn't this like this person's going, well then this person starts to talk and then this person's going and that person. So yeah, I do think pros and cons to both sides. But what would be your encouraging word to someone who is maybe a little nervous about starting, or maybe they just haven't done it before and they are excited? What would be your encouraging word to them?
I would say don't get discouraged after your first session, because it is easy when you are playing for the first time or you're new to feel lost. Like, I don't know any of this. Am I ever going to figure it out? And it is just one of those things that it's hard. We're talking about tips, right? Like, here's some tips that you can do to be more prepared. But the best preparation is just to play and to do it. And so I would say, like, my encouragement is don't get discouraged if, and when you're playing for the first time, you feel lost, because everybody feels that way. And don't feel like you should have prepared more or there's something you should have done to prepare more. That really you'll learn the most by actually doing it and playing.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the best things about the D&D community is that it's one of the most like supportive, like easygoing communities that you can be a part of. And so you're right. A lot of times you get into a session and maybe it is your first time and you're playing with people who have played 100 times. And so they are like jumping in and doing things really fast. One of the things that you talked about was how with role play, we would all bounce off of each other and you just weren't really sure about where to jump in,
right?
Or when to jump in or how to jump in, or if you should or shouldn't. And that can be a discouraging thing to think like, well, I didn't contribute, or I wanted to contribute differently and I didn't, or whatever. 99.99% of players are going to try to help you in that.
Right.
And so, especially dungeon masters, most dungeon masters are going to be totally fine with saying, oh, hey, you can't do that because the rules are X, Y, and Z. And they don't care because you're a new player and they know that you're a new player.
Right.
And so don't be discouraged by that. Don't be discouraged thinking these people all know how to play and I'm slowing them down. One, you're not slowing them down. Two, they don't care. You're willing to play Dungeons and Dragons with them. Yeah. Like that's ultimately the most important thing. I love these tips. I think they're great, especially for beginners. If you all want to experience Dungeons and Dragons, you're new to this and you aren't really sure what to expect, check out the 20 Sides podcast. It's a great experience of what happens at the table. And there's plenty of times that we say, oh, well, you can't this, or, oh, hey, well, and we've been playing for years. So great way to kind of dip your toes in. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts. You can check out Kate on the other side. It's on our Patreon, 20 Sides Pod as well. Thank you for being here, Kate, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Happy playing. # know your character.